Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Imperial Armour, where today we are having a look at the Basilisk self-propelled artillery gun, also occasionally referred to as the Earthshaker, though this is a pinch misleading, as it is the cannon that is known as the Earthshaker, whereas the cannon on the Chimera chassis is the Basilisk. Though it is difficult to deny, of course, that it is the gun that is the main star on any artillery piece. And the Earthshaker most assuredly is a star, as it is by far the most common artillery piece in the entirety of the Imperium. Hardly a single artillery regiment in the whole of the Imperial Guard exists without the Earthshaker at its core. The only exceptions would be hyper-specialized heavy siege regiments, employing practically nothing but Medusas or Colossus bombards, or light airborne regiments perhaps equipped with Griffins, or hyper-high-tech regiments that may have replaced their entire battery capacity with the far rarer Manticore. But besides these one in a literal million exceptions, the Basilisk and the Earthshaker can be found at the core of virtually every Imperial Guard battery formation. Often supported by different guns, absolutely, the aforementioned Griffin with its heavy mortar, or the Colossus Bombard and its ability to smash open fortifications and bunkers that even the Earthshaker cannot dent. But it is the Basilisk that is the workhorse with its 132mm cannon, with an effective range of upwards of 15 kilometers, which can be increased to 20 to 30 with overcharged munition. Though this does put a pretty ferocious strain on the barrel, and is rarely done, as it requires a steady stream of replacement parts to keep the gun operational. Speaking of the gun, the weapon has a traverse of 3 degrees and an elevation of 0 to 59, allowing it to carry out its bread and butter task, which is indirect artillery bombardment, and also to a limited degree engage enemies over open sights, though the lack of gun depression does limit it in this regard. As for the hull, the Basilisk weighs in at some 40 tons, and is propelled by a Vulcanor 16 twin-coupled multi-burn engine, capable of some 35 km per hour on-road and 20 km off-road. The standard Chimera hull also comes with a forward-mounted heavy bolter with his own dedicated ammunition supply located next to the driver's position. The hull also has storage capacity for some 20 132mm rounds for the main cannon. The standard munitions loadout for the Basilisk is near universally HE shells, with a couple utility shells thrown in just in case. Things like smoke, star shells, incendiary, or the odd occasional armor-piercing round. The Basilisk is also capable of firing hyper-rare precision ordnance bunker buster munitions, though these are handed out exceedingly sparingly and almost always under the direct supervision of the priests of Mars. These highly valuable shells will usually not even be stored on the guns themselves. Instead, each Basilisk artillery battery will be accompanied by a number of Trojan logistical support vehicles. These will carry both spare parts for emergency on-the-field repairs to the Basilisks, and also additional ammunition, both the more valuable stuff alongside more utility shells and extra HE munitions, as 30 rounds per gun. It's enough to scare the ever-living hell out of an enemy, and a pinpointed barrage can do a lot of damage, but in an extended artillery duel, you're going to need a hell of a lot more than 30 rounds a gun. The Trojan is also capable of towing both the non-self-propelled Earthshaker artillery piece and of attaching itself to the Basilisk and towing it off the field too, should it be knocked out, damaged, or in some way incapacitated. Finally, the standard open-top Basilisk comes with a crew of 5. 1 artillery officer, 1 gunnery specialist, and 3 loaders/utility crew members that can also do things like operate the heavy bolter and drive the Basilisk. The crew can also further customize their vehicle depending upon regimental regulations, etc., with things like camo netting, dozer blades for easier entrenchment work, or pintle-mounted weaponry, should they expect to find themselves on the sharp end of things a little bit too often. There are also a fair few little variations on the Basilisk, or more specifically, on the carriage carrying the Earthshaker gun. For example, the Armageddon pattern comes with a fully enclosed crew compartment. A very good idea on Armageddon considering the frequent dust storms in the area. Yet further variants can also be found on the gun itself. For example, the Lucius pattern produced on the world of Krieg comes with a gun recoil absorber mounted on the top of the weapon. The Phaeton pattern is more heavily specialized towards being a towed artillery piece and comes with 4 tracked mini carriages with 1 on each end of its stabilizer legs, allowing it to be towed far more easily. Though I also imagine all of those little tracked carriages must be an absolute hell to maintain. I would not want to crew that particular variant of the Basilisk if I'm entirely honest. Oh, Basilisk. Earthshaker, excuse me. And, well, whilst we're about to move on to the doctrinal applications and the tactical applications of the Basilisk, we are also going to be talking about the Earthshaker on its far less mobile carriage as well. Because a lot of their duties do of course overlap, though in slightly different ways, and slightly different specializations, of course. So, the strategic and regimental applications of the Earthshaker and the Basilisk. This is where the largest immediate distinction must be made, since the Basilisk is of course a self-propelled artillery piece, giving it a lot more flexibility in terms of where it is firing from and at what, and how safe it can be as well. Counter-battery is a real danger to any artillery piece, and being able to simply fire and then move is always the best defense. Now, counter-battery is one of those things that 40k never really properly covers, which is a bit of a shame, as it has been a major part of all armies' doctrinal applications of artillery for a very long time now, to the point that the more traditional towed immobile artillery, well, there are many that say that these guns will be de facto obsolete in a near-parity modern war. Now, granted, the military experts do have a nasty habit of crying obsolete, obsolete at anything and everything that actually gets destroyed on occasion, but to understand the wider implications, let me give you a brief rundown of what exactly counter-battery operations are in the 40k sense. And this is where we have to be a little bit careful, because counter-battery now and then were very different things. Right now, we have modern-day systems that are capable of detecting the location of an enemy gun based on nothing more than a brief snapshot of a shell's trajectory in flight. In other words, the system doesn't even have to observe a flash or hear a sound or see the artillery system itself. All it needs to do is look at the shell, look at the curvature as it travels through the air, and then it can algorithmically determine where the firing gun is likely to be. This is some pretty damn sophisticated software here, and, well, at least I've never heard of a 40k equivalent, so we have to fall back on the more traditional ways of counter-battery acquisition. As first and foremost, you gotta figure out where the enemy guns are. There are, of course, a variety of ways to figure this out, especially if the guns are non-mobile, but in the case of guns that constantly shift their position, the best ways to figure out where they are when they are shooting is flash observation, sound ranging, and direct observation via, for example, airborne observers, or, potentially as well, orbital assets, as that is something that 40k has that we don't. Spaceships. Now, the first flash observation was originally started in World War I, where they would simply look, primarily at night, at the flashes created by the artillery pieces, and then roughly guesstimate round about where the guns might be. In 40k, I would imagine that there would be auger or sensorium equipment powerful enough to detect flashes even during the day, so that would definitely be a part of the firing solution. Then there is sound ranging. We know that sound travels so and so quickly through the atmosphere. Thusly, if we can see the flash and hear the noise, we can figure out how far away the gun is. Assuming the local Imperial Guard artillery officers knows how the atmosphere affects the speed of sound, they will then be able to gather ranging data from the enemy weapons. And finally, observation. This one's pretty obvious, of course. If they have an aircraft in the area capable of directly observing the enemy guns, then yay. All they need to do then is have the information relayed to them. Same with spaceships, though on a bit more of a grandiose scale. It would be entirely feasible, presuming the enemy doesn't have any anti-orbital weaponry of course, for ships to simply chill out in high orbit, constantly taking high-resolution pic scans of the engagement area, and picking out when and where enemy guns are moving into position and beginning to deploy. In these cases, preemptive counter-battery might also be very, very possible. And in the case of a weapon platform like the Basilisk, which is open top, counter-battery is a massive danger, even more so to non-mobile towed guns, as they can't move even when the artillery shells begin howling down around their heads. In these kinds of operation, self-propelled guns have an enormous advantage, as they are able to move into position out of concealment, elevate their guns, fire off a few rounds, and then move immediately. Modern artillery systems even have the ability to fire several shells at different degrees of elevation, so as to make sure that the shells, when they actually arrive on target, will do so near simultaneously, giving the target the minimum amount of warning possible that they are actually under artillery attack. Now, of course, these kinds of counter-battery operations would usually require a set of specialized tools as well, something that, again, well, I've never really heard of existing in 40k, but it seems reasonable to assume that at the very least the more high-tech worlds have figured out some sort of counter-battery system that would be attached to the larger specialized Basilisk batteries. Of course, non-mobile Earthshakers can also carry out counter-battery, though, being in one location, they are far more vulnerable to getting it in return. There are ways around this, for example, like creating dugouts for the guns, making sure that the minimum amount of shrapnel can interfere with the gun crew's work, creating overhangs to intercept the shrapnel, or even creating full-on bunkers in which the guns are placed. And artillery bunkers are damned hard nuts to crack, as anything short of a direct bunker-busting hit is going to do nothing more than shake loose some dust onto the gun crew's heads. But counter-battery operations are one of the more esoterical applications of artillery, as the most common is, of course, the reduction of whatever goddamn unlucky son of a bitch is located on the other end of the barrel. This is a task, of course, in which any artillery excels, though it must be mentioned that the Earthshaker is a pinch small. A 132mm gun is more along the lines of medium to lower ends of heavy howitzer territory. This, in all due likelihood, also explains part of its not amazing range. 15 kilometers is not dreadful, but it's a solid 5 kilometers shorter than our modern-day 155mm equivalent, and it's less than half of the more advanced end of modern artillery. Hell, with RAP, we've got guns capable of firing up to 60 plus kilometers. Now, 15 is not necessarily anything to write home about. The Earthshaker does make up for their shortcoming, though, in reliability and pace of action. Earthshakers are designed to fire and keep firing for hours and hours on end, with only occasional and easy-to-do rudimentary maintenance required, like the occasional switching out of a gun block, or the odd hour here and there to allow for the gun to cool down during lengthy series of shots. This is crucial in the 41st millennium style of warfare, where all too often you are not seeing mobile formations trying to hunt down and batter one another, but instead lengthy siege warfare with tremendous formations grinding one another down over the course of years. This is where I'd take an Earthshaker over a modern-day artillery piece any day of the week. The shit we're building today costs millions upon millions upon millions, and millions more in constant specialized maintenance and replacement parts, whereas the Earthshaker can be kept in action for hours and days and weeks and months, with ready-made, mass-manufactured replacement parts that can be practically slapped into place in an hour or so. The wider strategic deployment of the Earthshaker and the Basilisk then are primarily in areas where long-term wearing down of the enemy is required. The Basilisk is absolutely capable of quick blitzing overwhelming artillery barrages, but with a ammo load of no more than 20 shells per gun, and let's assume a full reload per gun carried by Trojans in each battery, the weapons are going to run dry very, very quickly once on active maneuvers, as it has only about half the ammo load on board as the modern-day US M109A6 Paladin, for example. But what about the tactical applications of the Earthshaker and the Basilisk? Now, you might think simply just firing HE shells at the enemy is a pretty self-explanatory tactic, but oh no. There's a lot more to artillery operations than simply just shooting at whatever's in front of you. Now, of course, if you've got a Siege of Rux scenario, then finesse is going to have to be replaced with good old-fashioned attrition, but not every battle is a centuries-long siege after all. And even if it were, there are still differing applications for an artillery piece. I mentioned the utility rounds earlier. The Basilisk is capable of carrying illumination round star shells, which are fired out across the battlefield to shed light on a big area. These are used both defensively to make sure that nothing uncomfortable is crawling across no man's land, and offensively to allow troops to engage in active combat during night operations, though obviously once you start firing star shells, it's going to be pretty obvious that something is up somewhere. Then there's smoke. Smoke is always useful offensively as well as defensively. The battery is about to be overrun by enemy tanks. Well, a nice little smoke cover should give them the time they need to disengage. You're carrying out an attack on enemy lines. Once again, smoke will make it a hell of a lot more difficult for the enemy's weaponry to pick apart your troops as they cross no man's land. They are useful for maneuvers as well. You need tanks and APCs to cross an area of open ground before darting into further concealment. Well, toss down enough smoke to cover the opening, and you've got yourself as safe a crossing as you're likely to get in the 41st millennium. The usage of these shells require close communications with the infantry or armored elements, as they are, well, cooperative in nature. Smoke isn't going to kill the enemy, nor does a star shell, but it is going to grant considerable advantages to allied forces. This is where one of those problems with the Imperial Guard rears its ugly head once again, however, seeing as the IG are not fond of combined arms formations. Now, larger red regiments might have a small groupage of artillery here and there as attached heavy support, but more often than not, things like basilisks will be organized in their own specialized artillery regiments, which immediately throws up a great deal of red tape in the way of any quick communication. If you've got a pair of regiments that like one another well and have served alongside one another for an extended period, then hopefully it is as easy as hitting up the commander of the battery on the radio and calling in whatever you need. But if you've got two regiments that are not particularly friendly and that haven't been working together for very long, there is no end to the bureaucratic complications that a simple fire support mission can offer up to your poor, unfortunate field officer. At least in this regard, the application of more openly destructive ammunition is far easier. Good old-fashioned high-explosive rounds intended to dig the enemy out of their trenches, or HE frag intended to shower huge areas with splinters and cut down attacking infantry, or in counter-battery operations. It is not fun to be reloading a gun whilst high-explosive fragmentation rounds are raining down around your head. Interesting little anecdote from the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. There was a neutral observer that was looking over a Russian artillery battery sweating in the fields hauling ammunition as they became the target of Japanese counter-battery. Fragmentation rounds were blowing apart in the air in clouds of smoke and shrapnel every few seconds. And occasionally entire battery crews would be chopped down like wheat, even as replacement crews were ordered out of trenches behind the guns to replace the losses, until the corpses were having to be tossed away from the guns they had been serving seconds earlier so that fresh victims could operate the cannons. And that, of course, was a mere hors d'oeuvre to the horrors of the First World War. In the 41st millennium, it would be even worse than that, as their fragmentation rounds are a hell of a lot more advanced, and there are a lot more weapons on the field as well. Counter-battery is of course one duty that the guns would undoubtedly be asked to do on a tactical fluid level, where each and every battery has to make sure that it's ready to answer at any point, at any time, in any area within its range, as knocking out the enemy's artillery will make life a lot easier on the rest of the Imperial Guardsmen that are going to have to be attacking. The suppression of enemy defenses is another valuable task. Now, there are several ways to do this. One is a swift, quick blitzing bombardment that hits minutes before the main attack begins. This will usually be carried out on a pre-arranged schedule with the Imperial Guard infantry that is going to be attacking the objective. And the idea is to drive the enemy out of their defenses and into their bunkers and shelters for just long enough for the IG to get nice and close, being able to cross no man's land without getting cut to pieces by pre-in-place weaponry. The other application that Earthshakers are not ideally suited for, but are certainly capable, is the wholesale reduction of enemy lines, where the idea is to fire so much munitions that bunkers, trenches, whatever it may be, is reduced to nothing more than collapsed piles of dirt and rubble. Though it does require an absolutely enormous amount of ammunition to even get close to achieving this objective. And even then, more often than not, it fails miserably, as I have a sneaking suspicion that the most commonly expressed falsehood in the history of modern warfare is a soldier looking out at a friendly artillery bombardment on an enemy position and saying to himself, "Man, nobody could possibly survive that," and then running into the machine guns the next morning. And speaking of the defensive part of it, that is another area in which the artillery excels. One of the damnable things about artillery is that it remains quite difficult to figure out where a shell precisely will land 15 kilometers away. Precision artillery is something that every army has strove towards for as long as there has been artillery in one shape or another. Indeed, it was even one of the main reasons why people were so excited about the idea of throwing bombs out of aircraft, because surely if you could fly directly over the target, you'd ought to be able to hit it. Well, yes and no, but the point still remains, hitting a target 15 kilometers away reliably is hard. Usually the best way to do so is to simply fire the gun and see where the shell lands, and then have forward observers tell you where it landed contra where you expected it to land, and then fire another shell until you know precisely what elevation, what angle is required to hit this and that area. In defensive engagements, artillery gunners would map out the sectors in front of their weapon on a grid spacing, so that they would have the precise settings for each and every grid. If they need to target this area, the gun needs to be set to this and these settings. If it needs to target this area, these and these settings will be required. When this sort of artillery plotting system is fully worked out, it can turn a huge area into the guns to an absolute killing zone, as precise and accurate artillery fire can be dumped on any area almost immediately. This has even led to some particularly nasty ideas, like, for example, something the Americans came up with during the Vietnamese War, and something that has been mentioned specifically in 40k and the Siege of Vrax as well, the idea of a boxed barrage. This is where you figure out where the enemy is attacking, and you start laying down artillery to either side of him, to the right and the left, in a continuous barrage so that the enemy cannot escape. Then you place similar blocking bombardments at the top and the bottom of the box, and then you start walking those bombardments up and down the box until nothing is left alive inside of it. This tactic in turn was a further evolution of ideas that had been created during the First World War and had been improved upon during the conflict as well, one of which was the idea of the creeping barrage, where again you'd figure out first and foremost exactly where the shells would land at which settings, and then you would set up a barrage directly on top of the enemy's first line of defenses. Once your own infantry begin moving towards that objective, the barrage would lift and move 100-200 meters to the rear of the enemy's position, making it very difficult to reinforce the front line whilst your infantry is assaulting it. Then the barrage might lift once again to move yet further backwards, allowing the infantry to potentially push their advantage. This could also be combined with a blocking barrage, where the artillery would simply hammer the enemy's rear lines to prevent the movement of troops, reinforcements, and also to complicate communications, back in the day when they tended to rely on landlines for this rather than radio waves. This can also be done due to security reasons, since a landline is impossible to intercept, whereas radio waves are all too easy. And of course, there's what the artillery can do just by its lonesome: harassing fire and the destruction of targets of opportunity. Say, for example, an enemy column that wanders into range, or in the case of Basilisk capable of rushing into position, they can see enemy supply columns, or lines of trucks or marching infantry, and carry out a quick artillery ambush on them, destroying or killing many, and driving the rest screaming off into the wilderness. But by and large, artillery first and foremost is a supporting tool. That requires close cooperation with infantry, armour, and other elements to achieve maximum effect. Because despite all the tremendous destructive capabilities of the big guns, simply digging a hole in the ground will offer up surprisingly effective defense against even the largest artillery shell. And on that note, I'll be wrapping up today's video. Hopefully you'll now have a better understanding of the Basilisk and the Earthshaker Cannon in 40k. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.